Good morning. I'm very glad to be here today. I'm very glad to be in this track because what I'll be talking about with you, hopefully in exchange, is how do we maintain what we experience when we come in this hall and see all of that imaginary being put out there. If you're a little bit like me, it was this wonder, this moment of feeling, wow, Earth is so beautiful. There's so many fantastic places. What a grateful species we should be to have been plunged on this one planet that allows for our species to thrive in the first place. So this is where I'll be coming from today, to say, who are we? It's going to be slightly non-digital to start with, to say, how do we kind of read back to understanding what we are as biological beings, but also as imaginary beings. So the ones that can anticipate a future, build towards that future, and thus really need to engage with our ideas of what we anticipate it to be, what we would like it to be, and how do we make sure that our actions today are leading us in a pathway towards that future. And this is why I've changed the title slightly to say we're in times of transformation. And in one sentence, that means nothing will stay the same if we keep on doing the same. So this is where I start from, and I have got 4 different categories for you that we go through. One is, as a scientist, you always start with context. Where are we? You look at yourself and you kind of widen up how you see the world around you or the situation you're trying to be a steward in, an agent in. And then to say, how do we understand this moment, this context, so that we can intentionally start shaping it towards something desirable? And then obviously we have a footprint. There's the ecological bits in there, but we also have a handprint. So how do we change the ways we've been doing things? So those will be the 4 different areas I'll talk to you. And all you've seen out there are different variations and bits and pieces that we find on that planet. That planet and its image, how it's been looked at for the very first time in 1968, has allowed for us to understand much better who we are. That we are immersed in something, and when you listen to the astronauts, they were only saying 2 things, basically. Wow, is this beautiful? And then how do we understand how this web of life, this web of white and blue and green works and hangs together so that we can maintain that beauty and keep that planet, the place, the only one that we have that's inhabitable and stays beautiful. And this is where I would like to bring home the very first message that I think today, more than important than ever, in the 21st century, we have to understand things slightly differently about those workings if we want to maintain that place as we found it. And that, in essence, means that we have to look at things in a much more networked way. So see the relationships between the things that we do and how the things that we tend to overlook are working, and to find a good balance, that's going to be one important term in here, so that we allow for those networks of life to continue regenerating themselves so that they provide stability for us and maintain what we're used to. And this is a very zoomed in shot of the exact same planet, which is under the ground. It's the mycelium, so the roots of mushrooms, and how they connect under the ground, totally unknown from us, to coordinate water transfer, coordinate nutrient transfer, coordinate between trees, coordinate between themselves. And the only thing that we see and eat is the tiny little fruit thing. But the massive bit of it is under the ground. And so are many, many other things that we tend to take for granted and not look at. And this is why today we have to change the things that we do if we want to have things stay the way that we're used to finding them. This is the planetary boundaries concept, and I think it is very important right now, especially as we see how it's receding in the background of conversations. We've seen it in our election campaigns. Not so important right now anymore, and if we talk about it, we only talk about climate change. But there is a whole thing to understand, and that's exactly how this planet Earth works. And these are 9 dimensions that researchers from the Stockholm Resilience Institute have put out to make us understand that those are different ecosystems from land use patterns to nutrient cycles, to nitrogen cycles, to aerosols being put in the air, microplastics coming back into our bodies once we eject, or the very convenient use containers in an unchecked way. But also biodiversity being crucial, which has a lot to do, obviously, with land use patterns. How do we maintain space for enough other species on this planet so that they can thrive and collaborate in the Musil way to make sure that our soils can store the water, can store the nutrients, rebuild what then the plants growing on top of them need. And this is the way that we can think of ourselves not only as explorers and consumers, but as stewards of that planet, as good ancestors to the ones coming after us, as cohabitants of this planet Earth, as we did talk about in or after 2 world wars for the very first time, when we thought about how do we collaborate as the United Nations for a model of using that world that will allow for everybody to find a space on it. And how strongly we see right now how that exact consensus is being ambushed by the most important superpower that has been sitting behind bringing out a lot of these institutions that were maintaining the collaboration pathways. So it is very important that other parts of the world wake up right now, because we do understand there's this insight overshooting planet Earth. Every year, taking more from those networks of regeneration than they can re-provide means that we have less and less. Less and less space, less and less water reservoirs, less and less possibilities to have the oceans stay the way they are, the wonders, the beauty that we dive to, the coral reefs, the colorfulness that we find there, turning bleached, white, lifeless. That is what hides behind Overshoot Day. And the more very powerful players understand this, the more they talk geopolitical imperialistic strategies. I want Greenland, I need this, I hope you understand. Ukraine, very interesting, because they have a lot of raw materials underground. Panama Canal, we need this to get through. Oh, Gulf of Mexico, let's rebrand it Gulf of America, just to make sure that the territorial claim where we can use what we want for our lifestyle expands. That means encroaching on everybody else's life and space to live. That means that the images that we put out start becoming something like a non-realistic memory of what Earth will look like, unless we start doing things very differently. That means that our species as a biological being can travel to places but not necessarily move very quickly anymore because it's too hot and too dry. We can put on air condition, which creates more energy use, allowing for us to hide from how the outside has already changed. We have very different versions of sunset orange in the sky. We might not get to places that we love to move to and had joint experiences that have the chance to bring people together. And we see how we're losing more and more space towards something that's uncoordinated, that loses its beauty, and that will force people to go elsewhere. Entire countries going under the sea level. What are we going to do if we're already finding it difficult to receive people having to flee conflict zones now? Where is everybody going to go that end up in the places that are hit hardest by the consequences of overusing our planet? So what do we do with that? I think it's time to make sure that it's not falling off the agenda. To say, we understand that there is a different way, that's not imperialism and encroaching on others, but to say, how do we rebuild this? How do we bring out a thriving surrounding again? How do we rebuild the ecosystems that we depend on? How can we have a different idea of progress, a different way of using this planet that allows for it to become more convenient again, more open again, and provide for more people again? And this is where we have to rethink. Rethink how we create our institutions, how we create our routines, and how do we use digital technologies to facilitate this. But the idea of what we want to achieve and which future we want to build always precedes invention and innovation. It's always the mind that will steer where we are going and what we invent solutions for. And this is why it is very important to completely drop this idea of sustainability. Those are not separate pillars. Economics is not distinct from environment. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an interest in claiming other people's territories, because it's the raw materials, the resources, and the safety that comes from the environmental system. And this is why we should just completely revamp the way that we think about successful economic strategies and successful use patterns. If there's one thing that's important for us to become good stewards of ecosystems, it's to think about the use patterns much more than only producing products that are less impactful in terms of negative footprint. It's how we use them and the frequencies. I'll come back to that in a moment. That's where the balance lies, the balancing moment. Because regeneration has a particular rhythm that doesn't lend itself to ever faster, ever more efficient. There's a limit to how fast living systems can reprovide. We know that from ourselves. We need to sleep in between. Otherwise, productivity gains are not going to necessarily feel good anymore. At some point, you need the regenerative bit. That's why we have seasons. And this is how we can think an economy. This is how we can think about how the design of the places that we go, the means of transport, how we go, but also the use patterns could be developing. So that we can come from a degenerative way of having overexploited to a regenerative one of rebuilding. Rebuilding and protecting what we all wish to go for and wish to spend our free time in, to break out of what's become a slightly degenerative everyday life, to recharge somewhere else. But unless we find a bit more balanced way of dealing with both sides, the places for recharging are going to become quite small. And the more frenetically we escape for weekend trips to the places to restore, the more we are destroying these particular spaces. This is just one example in agriculture to have a bit of an image in there, because a lot obviously is design in touristic places. It can work in cruise ships. It can work in very densely created small villages or settings that you just really want to make sure your impact is the least, and the way you embed it into the outside system allows for it to become part of it. The shift starts in the brain again. You're not competing with nature, just put up higher dams. You're trying to partner with nature. You would try to create landscapes that allow for the rain, when it comes more dense and more hefty, to find its way out of very small canals built into concrete, into finding its way to being soaked up by nature. It's had very good ideas about how to do this. It just doesn't normally come with concrete and very straight lines. It means that you have to allow for natural spaces that tend to be curvy, tend to be alive, and tend to be very green, which can be very beautiful, to have their space in our ways of building infrastructures and spaces. So how do we design for this with that diversity and this holistic idea about what should spatial design cater for? And then you come to a different way of looking at what is a good way of running societies and a good progress model. And there you see that economics and economy is always a means to the higher ends. It's societies and societies' well-being that should be the outcome of a good economic system, and that depends on maintaining what our environment can give to us and how quickly it can regenerate. And this is where I think you find a nice little overlap with all different concepts that you find from the regenerative world. They're completely different from this upward curve that we tend to use to measure progress, success, quarterly reports, amounts of travels. As long as the curve goes up, we think we're on a good path. Once you start thinking in regenerative, you will find imagery that has a circular shape. So this is how we start completely rethinking, because we don't pretend that throwing away is somewhat away, but no, it'll land somewhere else. And ideally, that waste becomes the raw material for a different process. That's how nature works it. And then to understand that everything is place-based. So how do we make sure that our use ways are allowing for the places that we visit to be strengthened to think of community that's already living there. When we see about the protests in Spain right now, the overuse of water for golf courses, for nice and prestigious second, third, fourth homes for people coming from elsewhere to relax, is exactly that sign that we're forgetting about the local community's basic needs for water, maybe before your golf course that needs to stay nice and green. And that's exactly the conflict about space and how to resolve it in a way that takes away the stress from people that are living in the places permanently and collaborate better between the ones that are temporarily visiting. And that's our responsibility as coming places. We don't have an entitlement to experience the best that we get just because we paid. We should get there with respect, with curiosity, and with engagement, and the intent to leave it in at least as good way as we found it. That would be a respectful, stewarding engagement with the rest of the world. And this is why the imaginary is so important. I mean, luxury has been one of the terms here as well, and yes, it has its place, but when you think of how far the imagination of the ones that don't only have a little bit pocket money, but also have a lot of intel, are envisioning already how they might spend the best of their times on an ocean so that they don't have to connect with the people living in those places that start looking very differently. And then just bring everything onto the ocean that you find convenient. How about we think about this slightly differently, to say, do we need to have massively oversized things standing around 95% of the time for us to sometimes get there? When you look at South Africa, Pretoria, the whole southern coast being basically vacant, except for 6 weeks of the year where everything's overcrowded, that's where use patterns come in. How can we think more about the infrastructure being there, being used in a way that allows for it to stay beautiful? And allows for us to think maybe some frugality would help for us to refeel what are the deeper values in life. Because we all understand that mass, once it exceeds a certain threshold, will undermine the experience that we've come to places for. I mean, this is that Instagram search, right? Everybody wants that one perfect picture, and then you stand in line for 3 hours. Worst case, it's the tulips fields or the lilac fields or whatever, and then they're all trampled down because everybody needed to have that image where they all sit in a pristine new thing, like a field untouched. And this is how we are basically cruising the planet to provide for an image for the second life, so others can be in awe of us where we've been, presumably lonely, and ruin the first life. And that's a bit odd. So I think we should all come back to thinking about who do we live for? For the experience in that moment that will give us the recharge that we yearn for, that will allow for us to rethink about the patterns, the rhythms of being alive, and that a lot of things gain quality when you take out the speed and the intensity. Or just to impress other people that we don't even know, that we don't care about, and that we know they don't care about us as soon as we're not as cool anymore as it looks like on our images. So how do we want to stay stewards of this planet? I think it is very helpful to really connect with building the ways that we think normal engagement should look like. And this is where I come out of the first ideas and bring it back to setting rules, because we know about this gap between information and ideas about how we should change, and then the notion of, whoa, but if no one else changes, why should I? Because then I can't really solve the problem. And this is why there is a new concept that I find utterly important, and as we have a lot of corporations here, it's about your duty to engage as an institution, not as an individual, to shape the rules of using our global commons, because that is the concept that's behind all that beauty there. It's not only the climate, it's biodiversity, it's the oceans, it's everything that only works if we use it in a sensible way, and that if we overuse it, we'll lose exactly the benefits for all of humanity. And that means we have to find a way of agreeing how we use it, so we don't destroy it by everybody trying to get the most of it. It's called the tragedy of the commons, And tendentially, there's 3 different solutions provided for it. One is everybody needs to be educated, and then somehow will change their ways of behavior. I don't think that's worked. And as I said, as long as we feel everybody else is not doing it, some are ignorant, others still don't know, why would I? Because the size of the problem is too big. The second one is privatize everything. So we chunk entire planet into different pieces, and then everybody gets to use their piece, and if they overuse it, tough for them. That would be aligning freedom with responsibility for the consequences. We've seen in the yacht imaginaries that some people are not really wanting to live with the consequences of their complete overuse of the planet. They're just kind of building bigger chunks for themselves. So the third one is, how do we find rules that allow for a way of using these things in a collaborative way that allow for us to maintain what we have? And I think democracies and the kind of multilateral ideas of governing this planet so that everybody finds a space long term has exactly that built in. And this is why we need for those players that are impactful on what politicians dare to do these days, and that's more and more industry, that's more and more the business sector, to help them to create the kind of rules, even if it means that they will really have to change their business models. I hear it everywhere. Yes, we can take out gasoline from our portfolio, but if we do it and demand isn't reduced, that means someone else will provide for that gasoline, and we at least have put some additives in so that it's not as bad as the competitor's solution. So we stay in that rat race of not being able to reduce the overall consumption unless we have a joint idea of doing it. This is why the CO2 price has been an important instrument, to say everybody has to reduce the emissions. And then the best strategies can find through, and then the best examples and solutions will be the ones that can streamline and become the new normal. But this is why everybody is, as a business now, called into action to say, help us, bring us the rules that allow for us to change our business models. Because we know otherwise we might be small little niches that do the kind of ecotourism. Individuals are saying, I'm only backpacking now, I only fly every 3 years once somewhere. But in overall, we won't get the problem solved. So this is why it's much more than printing sustainability brochures, but to make sure that your handprint, your way of engaging in public, in the discourse, maybe in your commercials. Endless wonders was just one claim I saw out there. How about limited wonders? Protect them. They're not endless. And then when we promise that everybody can use them as many times as they want to, as long as they have the cash, they're ending. So how do we make that sure that this is conveyed and then have a much more appreciative way of dealing with that home? And who are the role models that would have to start from that or with that? How about not contracting as many influencers and telling them how about you become part of the tulip ruining flock? And rather say why they stayed home, why they found a way of finding attractiveness in the place that they live, rather than only finding it in their short little time spans. They go somewhere else to get out most for them. And this is why I know it's a slightly convenient message, but it is one that's full of invitation. Let's make sure that in 20 years' time, the imagery out there isn't made by artificial intelligence, but still can come out of photography. And this is why we have to think about our envisioning of the future in order to be able to build that future and start with it today. And be knowledgeable that we can really shift the ways we do things. We've done it many times, and we've got the economic power, we've got the technological power. We have, in many places, the knowledge. What it takes now is a movement and a will. And then we can change that different future, become the good ancestors, and allow for everybody to have a wonderful experience when they travel in a respectful way. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Maja Göpel. It's such a pleasure to have you on that stage. Thank you so much for a lot of keywords. And of course, we are now very thrilled to have questions from the audience. But also, of course, keep on submitting your questions. Maja, before we dive in, when we talk about the future, sometimes there are many different visions of the future. Can you give us the vision that is most common among us human beings? Is there one vision that connects us all, or are there so many disruptive different visions that we cannot even connect, and that the connection is the first priority to do?
What I found easiest is to not necessarily go into detailed ways of describing, but just in the first moment of imagining. And when you do that, you can test it yourself. We've been doing it in lots of different classes and places. How does the future look like that you would like to live in? Just describe what you feel and see around you. It's very peaceful, very green, and rather quiet. So it's a bit not what we have in our everyday lives, most of us. And that, I think, is an interesting one, so that we can understand where we might want to change both sides, both of the common, normal, everyday life, and then understand why we're yearning for all that kind of getaway moments. Yeah.
Another topic that you touched upon was the corporate political responsibility, this concept. What should we learn from that concept, and what is it to do that we need to be aware of, that we all need to bring action into that concept? Maybe you can dive a little bit more into the concept that you mentioned.
Yeah. No, I think it is an answer to a conundrum that I found in particular when I worked in Brussels, because it was on the one side people from business leaders sitting on panels saying, oh, we can't really do anything unless we get the long, loud legal signals from policymakers that allow for us to really shift our investments and recreate different business models. And then the next time, when you are in Brussels, you understand how people from the same company saying that are doing everything they can behind the doors to make sure those long, loud legal signals will not ever see the light of day. And so this is why I went around and said, can I ask you guys something? Are you fighting internally, or are you shaking hands and say we fooled them outside in a very, very effective way? And this is where I've come to the moment where I think there are fights in companies, and I think many of you that are interested in this orange state may even know how it is really a quest to bring those sustainability issues to the finance department. And this is why I think it is very, very important to go the next step and to say, we mean this, we have skin in the game. And we are the ones that are actually helping policymakers to build or push back against this whole thing that sustainability goes against economics. And just as an incentive, we see that there is, with IBM having the business value calculations, or PricewaterhouseCoopers and Accenture going for understanding which companies are more sustainable and more successful in the normal triple bottom line. And they very clearly link it with the mindset and the intent of the leading personnel, mostly the CEOs. So they start dividing, not saying the CEOs, but dividing between transformative ones and normal ones. And this is where we are right now as well. And we see a strong lash onto, for example, the European regulatory framework from the ones that are firmly categorized in the normal. And we see a bit of a holding back against abolishing all those rules from the ones that understand already that they have to reduce the risk, and it's easier if it's a level playing field. And it allows for them to see the benefits as well. So just to bear that in mind, it's not the economy, it's not the businesses. There's always individuals, and some see the potentials, and some would much more like to stay where we are.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Maja. Let's dive into the Slido questions. I see a first question here on our screen. In times where political parties, green parties, get stigmatized by far rights and conservatives, how do we handle such developments in order to save our planet? Maybe that's $1 million question.
It is. Right? No, I think everybody is utterly concerned about it. And I don't want to sound sarcastic, but my hope is that they're exaggerating so much so quickly right now that we all feel how disgusting it is. I don't know who of you saw that I think it was on Instagram, where Trump was posting the video about a Trump Tower in Gaza, and Elon Musk throwing around dollar notes to small little dark-haired children. that this was their great idea about how they would bring peace to Gaza. I really hope, and the way they've been dealing with former allies and friends, and Canada all of a sudden being an antagonistic country. I lived there for a while, and it's been the best relationship ever. So I really hope that this will really accelerate and bring our infighting out again, because we understand that there's something much bigger out there. So it's a bit like a strong crisis being as intense as quickly allows for us to shape something that is a counterbalance, rather than doing it slowly on their side, taking something like 4 years and then chunk by chunk dismantling everything before we have really understood how bad they're trying to make it. So it's really crunch time. It's really full-on crunch time, and we need courage, and we need standing up, and we need to take this advantage of the moment of crisis from the outside to overcome some of the gulfs of non-collaboration between the ones here. Yeah. I think it's starting to shape up when you see how the tone of antagonism is mellowing down between the democratic parties, and Europe is moving closer together again.
Do you see the crunch time also in Germany?
I think it'll find its way now. Okay. I mean, everybody in Germany knows there was a whole thing with a debt break, and we can't have more government spending. It's impossible. It was a big blockage between the old government and the party that's now become the strongest, the Christian Democrats. You might call it unfair play to say we're going to block this and block this and block this until the economy gets so bad, and now that we are in power, we're going to change it to say, economy is going to start thriving again because we have much more spending power. At least they're doing it now. And I think this is the kind of moment where we're all challenged to say, okay, let them have it, and let's hope that people see that others were not blocking it before. Mm-hmm. So this is where I think we're at this moment of how can we find our greatness in saying, at least it's moving now.
Thank you, Maja. Let's look into the next question. How can we make sure that especially the Gen Z that is more into social media rethinks their behavior before ruining the nature by taking a picture for social media?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because Gen Z's been so distinct, at least when I look at how they're being surveyed and monitored and grouped and clustered from former generations, in the sense that they would be much more on their well-being, so that kind of time balance, but also the way that they're eating and treating themselves. So there's a strong sustainability package in that generation as well. But I heard recently, and we saw in the polls as well, that the environmental concerns are going down in favor of the social ones. So there's a lot of fairness, a lot of wanting to see where, that generation finds a space, to say the old ones have really had it all. Why are we the ones that should move first? And how do we make sure that we connect and collaborate for redistribution as well? And also to want to end that kind of hostility and really push back against the kind of pushback for women's rights, diversity, and all that. And we see a gender gap there as well in lots of the research, that women or young women are much more prone to change their diet, to look out for more social and sustainability investing patterns, don't want to go back to the old role model of the strong man telling everybody that Elon Musk's and them dream of right now. So that we do see different, I think, portions, how that whole generation is subdivided.
It's not just the Gen Z.
No,
right?
exactly. So I think it's really more about finding subgroups and then say, how do we expand it across sectors and across generations to say, who are the ones that are able to see a steward solution where they want to have a space for everyone in it and have complete ingenuity. I mean, what we have in the drawers and the shelves and the labs of innovation, like how you can create lots of this stuff with mushrooms, how you really make sure that you collect the plastic waste and put 3D printers in places that are remote to make sure it becomes something else. There's so many solutions out there that just don't become streamlined because of the political framework missing. So many see this, and this is where I think we have to go across the typical sector groups and then find the ones that are more the like-minded ones, because they have different levers at their hands. So they could be the ones that are influencers, pulling it out to say, I'm going to create something like a movement. And we do have those, right? And then others saying, we're the investors that really put impact first, and we're going to show you that business models of Traceless, for example, they're developing a whole way of developing plastics that will re-come back into the biological systems. So how do we support them, and what would be the linkages? And then how do they get political power? Maybe there can be some marketing campaigns from the ones that are good in that place. So this is more how I think about it, to go along the mindset alignment and then see what are the different levers for societal change that those can pull together. And I really recommend, if you want to understand a bit more deeply what people are motivated by, to go for the deeper surveys that are really doing intense interviewing, like More in Common in Germany is one, or the world value studies are interesting, or Sinus-Milieu studies, because they are really engaging, or the Sozialökonomisches Panel for those who are in Germany, because they really are engaging with people over a longer period of time, and they can tell you much more about how things really shift, especially on a value basis and on a priority basis, rather than these snapshot civic things where it's like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And then people get to say, yes, no, yeah, I like, I don't, about things that they haven't necessarily thought about because they're just browsing the internet. So be sure that you really look at what's been the way that people have been asked for their preferences, because one of the most encouraging and important messages for me was wherever I went, from every party they wanted more climate change than they saw in their party by now, except for the AfD in Germany. So this is what's going under in the way that media are reporting. And this is where we find more connection. But the more we go into the media reporting, we lose faith that we are enough people that would want this. It's a downward spiral. It's called pluralistic ignorance. So do listen more carefully, and then by exposing solutions and by being something that people feel touched by, because you do connect with a wider world here, use that communication power to bring out those commonalities so that we do believe again that we have that deeper source of A, belonging, and B, willing to collaborate.
Thank you, Maja, for this little homework, to spend a little bit more time also on surveys. There's another question, because of course ITB is a lot about destinations. How can travel destinations in developing countries participate actively in the sustainable transition? Leave no one behind as a theme as well. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend, or what are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, for once, in some places where it's not so densely being used by now, there is a huge opportunity, obviously, to say we're going to leapfrog, we're going to make examples like El Hierro, or others to say we're, from the beginning, going to say we do everything with renewable energy, we have our own waste systems, and we make sure that we're trying to go as circular as possible. I think something like ownership is a very interesting one, to say how do we make sure that the bigger resorts and that are not always just owned by companies that are channeling out the profits to countries that are, or corporates that are sitting elsewhere, because that creates a lot of the social tensions right now that we see popping up in Mallorca and other places. So how do we really make sure that the moment that you go somewhere, you make sure that the benefits are being shared equally? We see that everywhere, also with the acceptance of wind power, for example. Once we had it before that it was a lot of community-owned wind power, and then you put a windmill, and then you are getting the revenues in the place. So for having something in your backyard, you do benefit. And then we've changed it. The most powerful bidder would get it, and then the earning takes place somewhere else, and you have the thing in your backyard. That's not really allowing for a lot of feeling of acceptance and fairness. So this would be another thing. How do you really develop a community-engaged way of driving things forward? And the last one is, I think, totally talk about frequency. I mean, the Maldives and others won't benefit if more and more people are coming in higher and higher travel frequencies with more and more air emissions. So how do you get a bit back to when I grew up? I know it was one big vacation a year, and a lot of that meant you had 3 weeks at least in a row, sometimes 4, mostly 3, because parents wouldn't get more time off. And then you shoved everybody in a tiny car, and you took a tent, and it was still a fantastic experience. So why do we have this? And this is where you look at the travel patterns, much shorter and thus more often. And within the impact, talking about footprint this time, of travels, the transport is the one that is most impactful. So how do we allow for other ways of traveling, and how maybe that needs to be a pushback? That goes where Gen Z and others, I mean, also my generation, when we do job interviews, I hardly have anybody my age that has young children that wants to work full time. Most of them would want to work 30, 32 hours because they understand that it needs for other things to be done, like care work as well. So how do we make sure that maybe they can allot this time to say, if you work 40 hours, some weeks you can take out those 4 weeks and go for slow traveling. So this would be another way as well, to say tread lightly on our earth is maybe the notion. And then how do you redesign the experiences around that again?
There's another question talking about sustainable aviation fuel. So we are diving into another topic when it comes to the big future of traveling. What do you think about so-called sustainable aviation fuels or other technologies which pretend to make a sustainable aircraft possible in the future for some people? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the some people is the most important word there right now. If you want to get out of purely economic thinking, a very interesting indicator that is energy return on invest. It's called the EROI. And that is a good idea about what are the best solutions if we want to have the planet's capacity to regenerate for us at the forefront of the solution finding. And then you go looking at fuels that are being produced, even with renewables, but have to have lots of processing here and there, lots of chemicals in there, lots of reshuffling in there to finally come out in a liquidized or gasified form that then is being put in an engine. Whereas if you just took the solar energy, put it straight in the engine, it would be so much more efficient. You don't burn as many kilowatt hours on the way of turning it into something that happens to fit in an outdated way of creating movement. Why don't we just take the new way of creating movement? And then obviously for the bigger freight, and like ships and lorries and planes, that's going to take a bit longer, but also means we should stop pretending that normal cars can also run on hydrogen and other fuels. We'll need everything that we can bring out to have the things that we can't really replace quickly with electrified mobility sources. Because those are so big and they would need giant batteries in order to be able to go the longer distance they have to do, that it is a future thing. Maybe there's something for nuclear fissure there, I don't know. I don't want to go there, but also not really think about nuclear being something that could power our countries. Because it A, takes very, very long to build those things. B, no one wants to have that waste. So if it's fusion at least, fissure at least, sorry. And then fusion, I don't know where they want to go with that, if that's a smaller scale thing. But really be sure, everybody that pretends that it's no problem, we're going to have e-fuels, we can provide, thinking back of the curve, ever more air travel per person as our business model of success is not honest.
Okay, that's clear word. That's a clear word from your side, Maja. Thank you. One last question before we wrap it up.
No.
You talked about limited experiences instead of endless experiences when it comes to travel experiences. Doesn't that lead to some tourism for just a few people who can afford to pay then that?
No, I think I wouldn't even call it limited. I would call it real. Because a lot of what we're doing right now is beyond what would create a really immersive experience. This is why yoga, meditation, and all these things are so sought after right now. Because we understand that we're doing too many things at the same time, too quickly, and with too much attention distraction. And how we reconnect, how we find strength, and how we really are touched, find resonance with a higher thing that creates satisfaction out of that one moment of consuming, is exactly when we're open enough, when we're still enough, when we're present enough to allow for this to happen. That's a real magic in living beings. And this is why I don't understand why we're so amazed about replacing everything with stupid boxed digital alternatives. I'm always the kind of unpleasant person when you go to the fairs where these dogs jump around, you know, these kind of robot dogs with their green eyes and like, ooh, ooh, and everyone's fascinated. Really, people? Is that what we want to pour the best, brightest minds and the most money in, to replace things that are already there in a mediocre way and celebrate our species for being gods because we're imitating something? There must be a better way of using our minds and our money and our investment and our attention to provide for all those solutions and find out how technology can serve living systems and not replace them with mediocre substance or substitutes. And this is where I think that it's not limited, it's reopening. And that just means a deceleration. And then we can talk about how do we make sure that there is something, we're all Earth inhabitants, right? That there is a fair share of having that. some people think it's the most liberal concept. We've had it with the privatization of everything to say, okay, we have that amount of air miles that we can afford within the CO2 budget. Let's allocate it equally per head. Why would some people that have a lot of money be allowed to pump out, I don't even know the numbers anymore, it's ridiculous, 15,000 times as much as CO2 emissions in a year as others, just because they can afford it? The budget is not the money. The budgets that we're talking about today are real budgets, be it CO2, be it space, be it water, and that's why we should talk about justice. And then we can think about what are the solutions that allow for everybody to have experiences that are immersive, that are allowing for that way of convening and connecting. It will have to change the tourism industry a lot, I know, but it is very important to start thinking about how that might work.
Thank you. Professor Dr. Maja Göpel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks.
Stay with me for another second. And of course, you can share your thoughts with the hashtag ITB Berlin Convention. And before we are having a break, we have something else coming up, the Global Roundtable about next chances and next challenges. So a lot that we've just listened to will be, of course, further debated. Looking forward to see you back.